Davies. Right. Sit down, girls. It's because I come from sport where everyone's just guys. We're all guys together, right? Okay. So I'm going to introduce you to these fantastic women. You really don't need it, but I'm going to tell you anyway, just in case there's anybody in the audience that don't know the amazing things that they've done. Susan Smith, here on my left-hand side, is only ever allowed to wear green from now on, so that we know her. Susan is co-director of For Women Scotland, a campaign group dedicated to promoting and strengthening the rights of women and children. For Women Scotland won a landmark ruling in the Supreme Court in April this year, which clarified under the equality law, women and sex are defined by biology. We know that. We've known that since 2010 when they set the Equality Act, but the Labour Party don't seem to still know it, and the government don't seem to know it, and we've got to keep reminding them, but that was a huge win. So well done, Susan. Kate Harris. Kate is co-founder and trustee of LGB Alliance, previous vice president of American Express. I gave loads of money to her when she was younger. With an impressive record in global business management, Kate is a lifelong feminist and lesbian activist who worked at the Brighton Women's Aid and former volunteer and fundraiser for Stonewall. And last but not least, of course, Naomi Cunningham. Naomi has specialized in discrimination law, mainly, but not exclusively, in the employment context throughout her career. In recent years, Naomi has developed a particular interest in the interaction between the Equality Act and the Gender Recognition Act. Gender reassignment, discrimination, the single-sex exemptions in the Equality Act, and the public sector equality duty. Her public law work in the area of fair play for women's successful... Who wrote this? Judicial review of ONS guidance on the sex qualification of the 2021 census and several substantial pieces of advice for government and major public bodies.
As you may have heard, we won this landmark ruling which established very shockingly that women were protected under law on the basis of sex. And depending on which side of the fence you're at, this is either a moment of clarity, which is going to make the operation of the Equality Act so much easier, or it's the herald of the end of days. We're entering an apocalyptic hellscape where people are being genocided by misgendering all over the place. It's not affected them out there yet. I didn't see any of them performing the Dying Swan like what's his features, Oscar. Yeah. So how did we... this very obscure piece of legislation. How did this very obscure piece of legislation come to have such a seismic impact and sort out this knotty, thorny problem that everybody had been arguing about for probably the last 10 years? I think that the gender representation on public boards and the gender recognition reform, which ran in parallel through the Scottish Parliament, is a real object lesson of political failure, and it should stand as a warning for any budding politicians. So a lot of people forget that this Supreme Court victory was not our first judicial review. We actually won a judicial review in 2022 in the Scottish courts because the original bill that then passed into law and became an act in 2018 had used a definition of woman that was purely based on self-identification. It talked about the name on your utility bill or whether people called you she and her at work. And we felt this was unlawful. We couldn't do very much about it in 2018. And the lobbyists who wrote the scripts for this, they were very excited about it because they put something in law that then gave them a bit of a basis to cite precedent and go into future committee meetings and saying, well, you've already accepted the basis that this is what woman means. So we took that, started that in 2020. We won it in 2022. The judges in Scotland ruled that provisions in favour of women, by definition, excluded biological males. So we thought, hooray, we've done it. We can all pack up and go home. And of course, everyone ignored it. Not only ignored it, they just got worse, if anything. Male murderers were still in women's prisons. And Edinburgh Rape Crisis decided to appoint a trans-identified man who said raped women should reframe their trauma. So at that point, the Scottish Government did us a great favour, but we didn't really know it was going to be a favour at the time. They struck out the self-ID definition and they added in people who have a GRC. So now women were women and any man with a piece of paper. And that was the very narrow question that ultimately the Supreme Court were asked to rule on. Because if you see the people wandering around screaming their heads off and saying, I can no longer use the female toilets, well, you could never use the female toilet, sweetheart. And even if we'd lost, they could not have used them because most of them don't have a Fleming GRC. Anyway, the judges obviously recognised that you cannot have a read-through of a piece of legislation that says women mean one thing when you're talking about pregnancy and maternity and a completely different thing when you're talking about sexual harassment or discrimination. It makes a mockery of the law. And not only that, the Scottish Government said it would change all definitions of women throughout legislation, which would mean that a trans-identified woman with a GRC was, for example, no longer covered by the Abortion Act. So think about those things. They're absolutely absurd. And I think those were some of the points that the Supreme Court judges started to realise, that you could not have a definition that varied from sentence to sentence. And I know Katie is going to talk about the brilliant lesbian intervention and some of the nonsense that reveals. But unfortunately, there's resistance, and that's especially acute in Scotland. We're a smaller country, and we've got more interconnected civic structures. It's very embedded in the third sector organisations, because the activists started work early in Scotland. Scotland was one of the first places in the UK to fall to this, and they really got it embedded long before Stonewall took this on. They were in there in the rape crisis centres from about 2012, 2013. They were in the prisons, and that's why it's been going on for so long. We thought we'd just have to explain why this was a problem and that the demands of trans rights activists were incompatible. Unfortunately, no debate was very embedded and nobody wanted to talk to us. But I think as we've moved through, and especially with the change in the law now, that has been an incredible boom for everybody bringing cases. We did hope we'd win and that it'd all magically become right. But we're going to have to keep fighting. And this last month, we actually have lodged a summons in the courts in Scotland again on schools' guidance and prisons' guidance, because they are unlawful and they need to be struck out. The Scottish Government is dragging their feet because they're worried about breaching the human rights of male-identified prisoners who maybe need to be with the ladies. So we are still in a world where this science denial on a gigantic scale has been going on, and it's fascinating because this is a world where apparently truth and evidence and science are so important, and yet politicians are cowardly trying to avoid upsetting the TRAs within their own ranks. And I think for a lot of them, they're hoping to kick this can down the road. I know you've got elections in May, we've got elections in May, and I think it's critical that we make this an election issue. That's what we're trying to do in Scotland. When a candidate comes to your door, I would say, just ask them where babies come from and if a woman can have a penis, and see what they say. And work through the party's political manifestos, get the word out, fight on, because we can fight on. We can take it all the way, and we can win it. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Do you know the thing that annoys me the most? And, I know we have some fantastic guys in here. Thank you so much for showing your support as well. Whenever they talk about men's health, it's never a problem. It's a man's check for his prostate, right? Not going to do any of your checks tonight, guys, so don't worry. When it comes to women, it's someone with a cervix. It's so obvious that this is a men's rights movement, and that is the thing which is the most frustrating with all of this, that I remember my mum telling me that she wasn't even allowed to be on her first mortgage with my dad. And women made such huge strides. And I think, sadly, our younger generation just don't realize what they're giving away by younger girls. And that's what we have to constantly remind them about. And so next up to tell us all about that, the wonderful Kate.
First of all, thank you to the wonderful, wonderful, I call them the Welshes. I think they like it. But they do have an amazing track record of getting brilliant events here. I'm a Davies, a bit like our leader here. I've got a massive Welsh pedigree. I'll show you later. Okay. There's a funny thing about Wales. I call it the Welsh conundrum, because I'm just brilliantly creative. It is a fantastic place to be a lesbian. And I put that down to the fact that there are lots of fabulous Welshie lesbians. So, don't hesitate if you're a leser. Come to Wales. You can have the most amazing social life. They do country activities of all sorts. And I can thoroughly recommend it. It's a healthy, lively, active lifestyle. However, Wales, in many ways, represents, or is similar to, somewhere I'm thinking of like New South Wales in Australia. And in New South Wales, they don't know what a woman is. And in the Senedd, they don't know what a woman is. And I have been working with the Welshes for years just to get a conversation going with anybody in the Senedd. And it's been worse than bashing your head against a brick wall, because that just hurts you. But what we know is that the Welsh government has been paying thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds to organisations like my favourite, Stonewall Cymru, to get advice that they already know that they want. So we have the same circular corruption that we see in Edinburgh and at Holyrood. So letters have been ignored, there's a blank refusal to engage, and there's zero acceptance of the Supreme Court judgment. The big question is, will things change in May 26th? Thank you very much. I didn't mean that as a literal question. But thank you. We'll come back to that. Dee McCulloch in the audience here says, I didn't ask for applause either. I'm at the centre of attention for the time being. Anyway, this gentleman and Dee McCulloch say everything will change. I do have some bad news. Eluned Morgan will be staying on. However, I think we can celebrate that the following three will be going. Jeremy Miles, Jane Hutt, and Mark Drakeford. I'm not going to say au revoir. I'm going to say Foxtrot Oscar. So, that's the Welsh conundrum. About the lesbian intervention, just very, very quickly, I'm sure you'll agree, it was the lesbians what won it. We got involved, first of all, in the intervention in Scotland, in support of our friends, our very dear friends, the Scotties. And we've been working with them against gender ID. LGB Alliance's very first meeting, actually, was at Oran Mall in Glasgow, and it was a wonderful event where we were standing up against this ludicrous idea of self-ID. And one person said at the following meeting in January, one person said, self-ID will never become law in Scotland. And who is that, Susan? Me! And Lucy Blackburn said, I will give you a magnum if self-ID in Scotland doesn't come in. I said, thank you very much. I rang her up after Kemi Badenoch, and the Scottish Secretary of State said, go away, there's no self-ID in Scotland. I said, where's my magnum? Send it down. She said, it will melt in the post. I was misled. Anyway, the reason we intervened in Scotland was because when we first started LGB Alliance, we knew Scotland was the bleeding edge. And that's where we had some of our greatest meetings, our greatest solidarity, our greatest fights. And we have always understood that we fight and win together. J.K. Rowling, God bless her, was the one who said, without sex, there can be no same-sex attraction. That is why it was the lesbians what won it. If you have a spare moment, go onto YouTube. The Supreme Court has a channel where they show every single event that ever is happening there. You can watch the counsel for the Scottish government squirm, thinking, why did I accept this? Why? Help me, get me out of here. As she explained, that in response to questions saying, for example, lesbians are not attracted to certificates. In answer to the question from the very bemused judges, does a man with a GRC become a lesbian? Yes, Your Honour. So I felt for that woman. I just want to say a serious point here about lesbians. Of course, we're always bigging ourselves up because there's so few of us. But honestly, if you think about it, in the situation where you're thinking men are saying they are women, for you women who are heterosexual, that means that you're going to bump into them in same-sex wards. If you go to prison, they'll be in prison with you, or they could be in the loos, in the changing rooms, in your sports facilities. For us, it means they want to be in our beds, raping us. And I think the way I see it is that if you explain to an elderly judge what it means to a lesbian to have a man say, I should be in your space because I am a woman. However, I still have my meat and 2 veg. And the judges go, what on earth? So I do encourage you always to use the example of how horrendous it is to be a lesbian, and for us to be told that we should accept fully intact males into our dating pools and into our lives. So I was genuinely shocked when we won. I'm a miserable sort of person and very, very pessimistic. Susan was sitting in front of me, sobbing her heart out as the judge, whatever his name was, I've forgotten, Judge Hodge, sorry. She was blabbing away. I was in a state of shock. I just was waiting for him to say no, a man can be whatever he wants, because that was what I was expecting. And then when we came out of court, everybody just screamed, not least Susan. But what a wonderful day. Just talking about the subject of today's meeting, and I will hurry up, defining what the Supreme Court ruling means to women's rights in Wales. Just one thing here. Us and the Welshes have been fighting against this ridiculous LGBTQ plus action plan for a few years now. You'll be probably not that pleased to know that there are 46 separate actions in the LGBTQ plus action plan for Wales, which was published in 2023 by a load of complete lunatics. The point is that after the ruling of the 16th of April, it is likely that not one of these actions remains legal. The founding belief of anyone who groups together LGB with TQ+ is that a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man. And since the 16th of April, the law of the land has been reconfirmed, and unluckily for the Welsh Government and lobby groups who've spent so many hours sweating over life-changing initiatives for a non-existent community, the document will need to be chucked in the bin. It won't even need to be shredded. It's not interesting enough. And just lastly, this is just for the sake of I don't know what, but some of you may not know that in February 2025, the Welsh Government issued an invitation to tender for a project to evaluate the LGBTQ Action Plan. The contract is expected to begin in May 2025 and run for a period of 2 years, concluding in May 2027, when we'll all have died of boredom, with an option to extend for 3 months. The value of the contract, excluding VAT, is £160,000, or with VAT, just under £200,000. It's a shame and a sad reflection of so many wasted years in Wales. Why not hire one of LGB Alliance legal geniuses, genii? We should be able to sort them out for a much smaller amount. Maybe we'd give them a discount and settle at £175,000.
Thank you, Kate. I think one of the most frustrating things with the years and years that we've been fighting is the fact that it's taxpayers' money that's being used constantly to fight women. 51% of this country, I talk about us united, are females. And at the moment, we just don't seem to count, and if we want to fight and use wonderful people like Naomi, we have to raise every single penny to do it. Whilst these organizations keep using taxpayers' money to fight us. And when we ask the taxpayers, they don't want their money to be spent this way. And that's what's so frustrating, that this is what's been going on. So now to tell us a little bit about that and how Scotland have spent £250,000 of their taxpayers' money, I'm going to hand over the microphone to Naomi.
Thank you. Well, it's a great privilege to be here, and I'm delighted to have been invited. Can't hear. Tom, does it need to be closer? Is that better? Right. Susan and her colleagues in For Women Scotland absolutely blindsided my profession. I think a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, 2 years ago, possibly even less, there was not a discrimination lawyer in the country who seriously doubted that a gender recognition certificate would change the holder's sex for purposes of the Equality Act. And now we know it does. I was certainly one of those many who didn't think that what For Women Scotland have done would ever be achieved. I was quite sure, I didn't like it, but I said over and over again, the words of Section 9 of the Gender Recognition Act are clear for all purposes. That must mean including the purposes of the Equality Act. There's nothing in the Equality Act to say it doesn't apply. There's nothing in the Gender Recognition Act to say it doesn't apply. We don't have to like it, but it's clear. You just read the words and keep breathing. That's the inevitable result. So what Susan and her colleagues in For Women Scotland did was truly extraordinary. It overturned an overwhelming consensus in my profession. Does it matter? And if so, why does it matter? I'm going to explain that by reference to crocodiles in a little while. Before I do that, well, my script says I'm going to start by explaining very briefly how the Equality Act works. But we're going to go interactive for a moment now, because one of the in some ways sad and in some ways inspiring consequences of this whole ridiculous fight is that loads of people who ought not to have ever had to grapple with the detail of how the Equality Act works have had to become experts. So it may be that I'm preaching to the converted if I explain briefly how the Equality Act works. It may be you simply don't need to hear that from me. So can I have a show of hands? Would you like a quick canter through the structure of the Equality Act and how it works, or shall I skip on to the next bit? Quick canter? Okay. In the areas where it operates, the Act prohibits discrimination based on various different protected characteristics, so sex, race, disability, sexual orientation, and so on. It doesn't prohibit discrimination across the board. It doesn't prohibit discrimination in every possible area of life, specific contexts. So it says you're not allowed to discriminate on those grounds in relation to employment, and that's probably the most familiar one to most people, or in relation to services and public functions. That may be the second most familiar, or in relation to associations, in relation to education, and so on. Various specific areas. That leaves quite a lot of life where you still are allowed to discriminate. There's just no law to prevent you. And that's the answer. A question that's been coming up a little bit recently is, why can't the woman who was humiliated on Big Brother recently sue the TV company or somebody for the way she was treated? And the answer to that is almost certainly she can't, because she's not doing something in one of those particular... It's not that sort of relationship. It's not an educational relationship. It's not an employment relationship. It's not a receipt of services or public functions relationship. So it's just outside the scope of the Equality Act. So at the same time as prohibiting discrimination in various specific contexts, discrimination on grounds of those specific protected characteristics, it's obviously necessary that the Equality Act has a lot of exceptions in it. Because if you just say you're not allowed to discriminate on grounds of sex ever, say, or even on grounds of race ever, you're going to prohibit things that you shouldn't prohibit. So as well as those prohibitions, the Act has a complicated scheme of exceptions. Say, in the situations in which you need to be able to discriminate, and it's perfectly right and not unfair that you should be allowed to discriminate, you are allowed to. And that's all quite complicated and twisty-turny, and there are different criteria and different standards, conditions that you have to pass in order to satisfy and to get yourself within those exceptions. And they look different for the different protected characteristics. And if you think about protected characteristics, it's a ragbag of very different kinds of things. Sex is not like race. Race is not like disability. Disability is not like... They're not just different things. They're different kinds of things. Some of them are inherent, innate characteristics, and some are that you just can't change. Some of them are to some extent voluntary. Some of them are a kind of mixture of the two. And some of them affect you throughout your whole life. You can't, as we know, change sex. But lots of people... don't start their lives with a disability, but by the time they're elderly or middle-aged, they have a disability. And age, of course, changes through everybody's life in the nature of the thing. So they're all very different kinds of things, and they need different kinds of exceptions so that the law makes sense. Now, the old consensus, the thing that my profession almost across the board just confidently believed, that before for Women's Scotland, that a gender recognition certificate changed the holder's sex for the purposes of the Equality Act, that had a fairly subtle impact on the sex exceptions. It meant that if you were a man with a GRC certifying, contrary to reality, that you were a woman, and you were excluded from a lawful women-only service, that wasn't exclusion. That wasn't deemed to be exclusion. If that belief had been right, that wasn't deemed to be exclusion because of your sex, because the law thought your sex, everyone thought, the law thought your sex was just female. As far as the law could tell, you were just a woman. So you couldn't be being excluded because of your sex. You were being excluded because you were the wrong kind of woman. You were a woman not by biology or physiology or reality, but by certification. And therefore, it must have been because of the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. That was the way in which you were the wrong kind of woman, that you were excluded. So that was what we all thought. Section 9(1) of the Gender Recognition Act said a certificate changed the holder's sex for all purposes. I think everyone who'd given the matter any serious thought found that illogical and unsatisfactory and thought that it led to a lot of bad consequences. But it was very hard to see a way around what the word said. And I think that we all thought that judges would just look away from the obvious difficulties when they could, when they didn't actually hit them in the face. And when they did, when they really bumped up against them, would find ad hoc workarounds. And I think that's pretty much what happened for about 20 years, from the Gender Recognition Act in 2004 until the 16th of April, a date engraved on all our hearts, the 16th of April 2025. The most striking example of that, both Kate and Susan have already alluded to, the most striking example of the ways in which that reading simply made nonsense of it. And that is that if you assume that sex means certificated sex, the protected characteristic of sexual orientation simply doesn't work. Makes no sense, because nobody is sexually oriented towards people of their own sex, plus people of the opposite sex with a certificate, minus people of their own sex with a certificate. Sexuality, human sexuality is very, very various. And there's a tribe for most things, but I don't believe, even out there in the wilder shores of the internet, there is a tribe of certificate fetishists. I just don't buy it. So sexual orientation discrimination should have just never worked. Somebody should have said in one of the many, many successful sexual orientation discrimination cases that have been fought, hang on, you don't have this protected characteristic. Some bad person acting for a respondent who had discriminated on grounds of sexual orientation should have had this fiendishly clever idea and said, hang on, what is it you're attracted to? Are you attracted to, but you say you're attracted to women if you're a woman. Are you attracted to men with certificates? No, you're not right. Well, I've got you there then. You don't have the proper protected characteristic of sexual orientation because it's defined by reference to certificates. So your case fails. Now, I don't think that argument would ever have worked. I think it would have been laughed out of court. But on a literal reading of the Act, taking the words used seriously, that would have been a legitimate argument. It's never tried. So that's what I mean by ad hoc workarounds. That ad hoc workaround, I think, was applied over and over again without anyone ever easily thinking of that. The reason I say that, in a sense, the result in For Women Scotland isn't that important, and it really is important, but the reason I say that there is a sense in which it could be said not to be important, is that even under the old understanding, you always could say to any man wanting to use a women-only service, or almost always, sorry, no, we're not allowed to exclude you because you're a man if you haven't got a GRC. Sorry, no, we are allowed to exclude you just because you're a man if you haven't got a certificate. And if you have got a certificate, we don't care because we're still allowed to exclude you because of gender reassignment. Because in most situations, apart from associations, which is a biggie, I agree, but in most situations, there was also a parallel exception that allowed you to exclude on grounds of gender reassignment. So even if a man with a certificate was deemed to be a woman, you could almost always still say, no, doesn't matter. We don't care whether you've got a certificate or not. We either exclude you because you're a man if you haven't got a certificate, or because of gender reassignment if you have got a certificate, and we don't even want to know which it is. Either way, it's no may. That was the theory, but it was a bit complicated. It was a bit subtle. There was a different legal route to justifying exclusion depending on whether somebody had a certificate or not. And you had to decide blind without knowing whether a person had a certificate, because everybody believed you weren't allowed to ask whether someone held a certificate. Now, that's always been a myth. There's no law that says that you're not allowed to ask, but there almost might as well be, because the Section 22 of the Gender Recognition Act, which says it's a criminal offence to disclose the fact of someone having a GRC, if you've got to know about that in an official capacity, unless you've got one of a fixed list of excuses. And that makes it really scary to ask if somebody's got a gender recognition certificate. So in effect, you had to decide blind. And also there was no case law. None of these exceptions have ever been litigated, or almost never. There was certainly, there was no case law, I think it's fair to say. There were a couple of first instance cases which don't make case law, because case law is law that comes from decided cases, and only appeal cases actually make law. So there were a couple of first instance cases. There was no proper case law to guide you on this. I don't think that's an accident. I think there was a deliberate strategy of lying about the law, bullying people into giving way, letting men into women-only spaces and services, coercing, bullying people into quiet settlements very often, but never actually bringing it to a heading forward. So, for all those reasons, the whole business of using those exceptions effectively was made really fraught. And in practice, almost nobody dared try use them. And at the same time, and this contributed to that fear, we had an impressively effective campaign of legal misinformation in which Stonewall, Gendered Intelligence, and all the other groups pumped out the false message that if you just had the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, you had a right to be treated as the opposite sex for all purposes. And if you weren't, then you were suffering gender reassignment discrimination. That would be unlawful. And that, in effect, gave us self-ID across the board, up and down the country, in the public sector, in the private sector, everywhere, in education, in employment, in all contexts. And the sheer uniformity, I think, gave organisations a lot of comfort that they were doing the right thing. Something that was very striking to me in Peggy was cross-examining Isla Bumbat, get the right Isla there, and her defence that what she'd done to find out whether it was okay to let Beth Upton use the women's changing was she looked at the policies of all the other NHS trusts. And surprise, surprise, they'd all said the same thing, because it had all come from the same Stonewall training. And it was really striking that she didn't even know that her own trust was a Stonewall champion. So it was that embedded, that dug in, that it had passed from her consciousness or the consciousness of the organisation. It was just stuff they knew. They didn't know how they knew it. They didn't know they'd been told it by Stonewall. They just knew it, and it was wrong. So now the Supreme Court has told us that a gender recognition certificate doesn't change your sex for purposes of the Equality Act. And that means that any time it's lawful to exclude men, unequivocally, you can exclude all men by the same route just because they're men, whether or not they hold a gender recognition certificate declaring them to be women. Really is that simple. The answer is no. But even so, you could say that the practical impact of the judgment is quite small, because it only actually makes a legal difference for people who have GRCs, and there just aren't very many of them. They're still in the few thousands. And yet this little change to the law, this little change to the understanding of the law, because of course a Supreme Court judgment is declaratory. It's not a change to the law, it's declaratory, although it feels like it. It's declaratory of how we now know the law always was ever since 2010. This little change to the understanding of the law is causing convulsions in government and public authorities and private companies up and down the country. Why is it having such a big impact when its direct effect is limited to such a small number of people? That's where the crocodiles come in. I want you to imagine a village on the side of a beautiful, sparkling, clear lake with grass down to the water's edge and clean gravel on the bottom. All the villagers used to love swimming in the village, especially the children. But these days, children are scolded if they put so much as a toe in the water and ordered indoors. And that's because rumours have been circulating that there are crocodiles in the lake. The occasional inconclusive sighting has been reported, and the parish council has put up warning signs. A few people have been saying for years there are no crocodiles, and it's safe to swim, but almost nobody dares. It doesn't take an actual crocodile attack to keep everybody out of the water. The fear is enough. Now, finally, somebody persuades parish council to order a survey, and a fleet of state-of-the-art underwater drones scours the lake. The surrounding vegetation is peppered with camera traps. Teams of volunteers hunt for crocodile dung. Nothing. Not a crocodile poo, not a scale, nothing, no crocodile. The lake is safe. That's what the Supreme Court has done. The state of the law before for women in Scotland was like that lake that was rumoured to have crocodiles in it. You might be sceptical, you might think it was perfectly lawful to operate genuinely single-sex services. Lots of people have been saying for years that it was, but when push came to shove, almost nobody felt lucky enough to dive into the crocodile-infested lake and take their chances. And that's why we had self-ID by default. And that's why the practical consequence, when it finally comes home to roost, is capable of being so big. And the Supreme Court has done that operation. It's scoured every corner of the lake with its drones and authoritatively declared it to be crocodile-free. And that's what gives us that absolutely confident answer no to any man who wants to use lawful women-only spaces or services or join a women-only association, including a lesbian-only association, and so on. So it's only a small change to the law as well-informed lawyers understood it before for women in Scotland. But because of the legal misinformation because the legal misinformation before for women in Scotland had given us self-ID across the board, in practice, it spells a massive change, or it should, and I think in due course it will, spell a massive change in what people actually do and the confidence with which people actually operate single-sex spaces and services. But that equivocation between what we now understand the law to be and what people actually do, there's still a gulf. There's still a big gulf. And this is in one way, the most infuriating thing is about the present situation. That we have had this massive win. We have complete clarity about the law. You don't need to wait for the EHRC Code of Practice. That's supposed to provide an idiot's guide to the law, but the law is already clear, and the Supreme Court's done a pretty damn good job of making it idiot-proof in its own judgment. Idiots abound. But the pushback and the resistance has been like nothing I've ever seen in my career before. And that is because I think of the extraordinarily entrenched nature of the misinformation that had been being pumped out for decades, literally, and had made its way into every corner of all our institutions, of our public and private bodies. So the change is starting. I did briefly wonder when the Supreme Court handed down its judgment on the 16th of April, I had a moment of thinking, am I going to be able to retire? That's it. It's not looking imminent. And, you know, I say to people like HR people and employers, look, ultimately, we will arrive at depression and then acceptance, the last stages of grieving. But it's going to take a long time and a lot more litigation, I'm afraid.